The year is 1942. The world is gripped by total war. Every continent, every ocean, every life touched by conflict. Axis forces seem unstoppable, their conquests redrawing the map in tyranny's colors. In Allied capitals, leaders like Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin face desperate odds, united by necessity against a common enemy. Ordinary people endure bombings, occupation, and hardship, clinging to hope that feels impossibly distant. As 1942 dawns, the world stands on the edge, its future uncertain. The Axis powers, Germany, Japan, Italy, dominate Europe and Asia, their empires built on conquest and cruelty. Hitler's armies threaten Moscow, Japanese forces sweep across the Pacific imposing brutal rule. The Holocaust intensifies in Europe, while forced labor and massacres scar Asia. The Axis dream of a new world order, but for millions, it's a nightmare of oppression. At this moment, the Axis tide is at its highest, threatening to engulf humanity. Even in darkness, resistance sparks. Underground networks sabotage, spy, and fight back across occupied Europe. The Red Army halts the Germans at Moscow and braces for a stand at Stalingrad. In the Pacific, America rebuilds, striking back at Tokyo and preparing for Midway. In North Africa, the British rally at El Alamein. These battles will begin to turn the tide. Summer 1942. Hitler launches Case Blue, aiming for the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad. The German advance is swift, devastating Soviet forces and capturing thousands. But the Soviets trade space for time, stretching German supply lines thin. Hitler splits his armies between the Caucasus and Stalingrad, a fatal overreach. The stage is set for disaster on the Volga. Stalingrad braces for siege, its factories and citizens mobilized for total war. Stalin's order, not one step back. General Chuikov prepares to turn the city into a fortress. Civilians dig trenches, fight, and die alongside soldiers. The Luftwaffe's bombardment only strengthens their resolve. The city's ruins become perfect defenses. Stalingrad is now a symbol of Soviet resistance. The Germans have bombed themselves into a deadly trap. The battle for Stalingrad becomes a brutal, close-quarter struggle, or rat war. Every building, every room is contested. Life expectancy is measured in hours. Chuikov's tactics and Soviet snipers turn the ruins into a nightmare for the Germans. The 6th Army, trained for blitzkrieg, is ground down in relentless urban combat. Stalingrad bleeds both armies, but the city refuses to fall. As autumn turned to winter, the nature of the struggle in Stalingrad changed once again. The mud of October, which had slowed down vehicles and bogged down attacks, began to freeze solid. Then the snow came. It fell relentlessly, blanketing the ruined city in a thick layer of white. With the snow came the cold, a bitter, unforgiving cold that the German soldiers were completely unprepared for. The Russian winter, which had played such a crucial role in halting the advance on Moscow in 1941, had now arrived on the Volga. It became a powerful and merciless ally for the Soviet defenders, an enemy the Germans could not defeat with guns or bombs. The German 6th Army was still equipped with summer uniforms. They lacked proper winter coats, gloves, and boots. Frostbite became as great a threat as Soviet bullets. Soldiers huddled together for warmth in freezing cellars and ruined basements, their bodies racked with lice and disease. Engines of tanks and trucks refused to start in the sub-zero temperatures. Weapons jammed, and lubricating oil turned solid. The Luftwaffe was often grounded by blizzards, unable to provide air support or drop supplies. The cold gnawed away at morale, turning the once mighty Wehrmacht into a shivering, half-starved army trapped in a frozen wasteland. For the Soviet soldiers, the winter was also harsh, but it was a familiar hardship. They were better equipped, with quilted jackets, felt boots, valenki, and white camouflage smocks that allowed them to blend in with the snow. They knew how to survive and fight in these extreme conditions. Their supply lines, though perilous, were short. Ferries and boats braved German artillery and ice floes to cross the Volga at night, bringing reinforcements, ammunition, and food from the eastern bank. While the Germans weakened with each passing day, the Soviet defenders held on, their resolve hardened by the cold and their hatred for the invaders who were freezing in their ruined city. The fighting in the city reached a stalemate. The Germans, despite controlling over 90% of Stalingrad at their peak, could not dislodge the last defenders from their narrow footholds along the riverbank. The advance was measured in yards, at a horrific cost. The giant factory complexes, reduced to skeletons of twisted metal and shattered concrete, became the final battlegrounds. The fighting for the Red October steelworks and the Barricadi gun factory was relentless. Each workshop and furnace was a miniature fortress. The German offensive had run out of steam, frozen solid by the Russian winter, and bled dry by the city's stubborn defenders. The stage was now set for a dramatic reversal of fortune. While the German Sixth Army was being destroyed inside Stalingrad, the Soviets prepared a counterstroke. They built up forces on the German flanks, areas held by less well-equipped Romanian and Italian troops. Zhukov planned a pincer movement, codenamed Operation Uranus. On November 19th, amidst a blizzard, the trap was sprung. Soviet forces attacked the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies. The Red Army tanks raced west to Guadalcanal. Within 4 days, the pincers met. The German 6th Army was surrounded. Hitler refused a breakout, ordering the army to hold its position and promising supplies by air, a decision that sealed their fate. While Stalingrad raged, another critical theater was being fought in the North African desert. Here, the British 8th Army and the German-Italian Panzer Army Africa had been locked in a desperate struggle. The prize was immense: control of Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the Middle East's oil fields. The war in the desert was a war of movement, often compared to a naval battle on land. For months, the front line swayed back and forth, a constant back and forth known as the Desert Seesaw. Commanding the Axis forces was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, a master of surprise. Opposing Rommel was the British 8th Army, a tough fighting force that had suffered demoralizing defeats. By the summer of 1942, they had been pushed back into Egypt, with their backs almost to the Nile Delta. The fate of North Africa hung precariously in the balance. In mid-1942, Erwin Rommel launched what he hoped would be his final war-winning offensive. After his crushing victory at the Battle of Gazala, where he had captured the vital port of Tobruk and thousands of Allied prisoners, his Panzer Army Africa swept eastward into Egypt. The British 8th Army was in full, chaotic retreat. It seemed that nothing could stop the Desert Fox. His objective was Alexandria and Cairo, and beyond that, the Suez Canal. The mood in the British headquarters in Cairo was one of near panic. Staff officers frantically burned secret documents, and a pall of smoke hung over the city, an event nicknamed Ash Wednesday. The road to Alexandria seemed wide open. However, the British managed to pull their retreating forces together to form a new defensive line. This line was anchored at a small, insignificant railway halt on the Mediterranean coast called El Alamein. What made the Alamein line special was its geography. To the south, just 40 miles inland, lay the Qattara Depression, a vast, impassable salt marsh. This meant that Rommel could not use his favorite tactic of sweeping around the southern flank. He would be forced into a frontal assault against a prepared defensive position. For the first time in the Desert War, the British had a front that could not be outflanked. Here, they would have to make their stand. Rommel, despite his own forces being exhausted and his supply lines stretched to their absolute limit, knew he had to strike quickly before the British could fully recover and reinforce their position. In July 1942, he threw his weary Africa Corps against the Alamein line in what became known as the First Battle of El Alamein. The fighting was fierce and desperate. The British, under the command of General Claude Auchinleck, fought with grim determination. They bent, but they did not break. After a month of brutal attritional fighting, Rommel's offensive ground to a halt. The Desert Fox had been stopped, just 60 miles from Alexandria. Although the immediate crisis had passed, the situation remained perilous. Rommel's army was still dangerously close to the Nile, and both sides were now digging in, gathering their strength for the next round. The Desert War had transformed from a fluid battle of maneuver into a static siege, more akin to the trench warfare of the First World War. Both armies laid extensive minefields and built fortified boxes to protect their positions. The Desert Seesaw had finally shuddered to a stop. The world watched and waited to see who would have the strength to push it into motion once more, and in which direction it would finally fall. In August 1942, Prime Minister Winston Churchill flew to Cairo to shake up the command. He installed Lieutenant General Bernard Law Montgomery. Monty was supremely self-confident. He arrived ready to sweep the army clean. Montgomery addressed the 8th Army, declaring there will be no more retreat. Montgomery began reorganizing the 8th Army. New American-made tanks began to reach the front. Rommel launched an attack at the Battle of Alam el Halfa. Montgomery prepared strong defensive positions and used his artillery to smash the German attack. He continued preparations for a major offensive. On the night of October 23, 1942, under the light of a full moon, General Montgomery unleashed Operation Lightfoot. The battle began with a terrifying display of firepower. The artillery barrage was one of the most intense of the entire war. Their task was to clear narrow corridors through the deep minefields. The initial British assault became a brutal, grinding fight in the minefields, with casualties mounting rapidly. Rommel rushed back to the front to take personal command. Montgomery concentrated his armor and launched a powerful attack. The battle culminated in one of the largest and most ferocious tank battles of the Desert War. They were running out of tanks, and more importantly, they were running out of fuel. Rommel knew the battle was lost. With his army on the brink of collapse, Rommel requested permission to withdraw. Hitler's response was swift. Victory or death. Rommel defied the order to save his army. On November 4th, the Axis front at El Alamein crumbled. The victory at El Alamein was a massive turning point. The long retreat of the Axis forces from North Africa had begun. Days later, a massive Anglo-American force landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. The Desert Fox and his Africa Corps were now caught in a giant pincer movement. In the spring of 1942, the Empire of Japan was a titan in the Pacific. In 6 months since Pearl Harbor, its conquests were breathtaking. The military swept through Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Japanese forces landed on New Guinea, threatening Australia. The rising sun flew over a vast empire. The Imperial Japanese Navy was the most powerful naval force. Its battleships, like the Yamato, were the largest ever built. From Tokyo, the military leadership planned their next move, to shatter American naval power and force the United States to sue for peace. Admiral Yamamoto knew Japan couldn't win a long war against the US. His strategy was to destroy the US Pacific Fleet in one final battle. The target was Midway, strategically vital with an American airbase. Yamamoto assembled a massive fleet to threaten Midway. He was setting a trap, confident the US Navy would sail into annihilation. Admiral Yamamoto planned a trap, unaware the Americans had a secret weapon: intelligence. At Station Hypo in Hawaii, Commander Rochefort's team broke the Japanese naval code. They knew Japan planned a major offensive targeting AF. Rochefort suspected AF was Midway and devised a ruse. Midway sent a message about a broken water plant. The Japanese confirmed AF was short on water. The trap was exposed. Nimitz knew Yamamoto's target and timeline. Yamamoto was sailing into an ambush. Nimitz prepared his smaller force, including the hastily repaired Yorktown, positioning his carriers northeast of Midway to surprise the Japanese. On June 4th, the battle began. Japanese planes attacked Midway. Nagumo ordered his planes rearmed, a fateful decision. As Nagumo's crews rearmed, a scout plane spotted American warships. Panic ensued. Nagumo chose to rearm, ordering his planes to land and refuel, a catastrophic decision. The Americans launched their own strike. The first wave of torpedo bombers attacked without fighter protection and were decimated. But their sacrifice left the skies unprotected. American dive bombers arrived undetected. It was a perfect target. In 5 crucial minutes, the dive bombers struck Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The bombs turned the ships into raging infernos. 3 carriers were transformed into blazing wrecks. Japan lost its 4 best carriers and irreplaceable pilots. The tide of war had turned. The victory at Midway stopped the Japanese advance. The Allies needed to halt their push in the south, threatening sea lanes between America and Australia. The focus was Guadalcanal, where the Japanese were building an airfield. The US launched its first major offensive to seize the airfield. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed, taking the Japanese by surprise. They captured the airfield, renaming it Henderson Field. The Japanese reaction was swift, sending troops to retake it. A brutal 6-month campaign followed, fought against a determined enemy and the unforgiving jungle. The fight became a symbol of savage combat. They called it the Green Hell. Brutal naval battles were fought and the waters became known as Iron Bottom Sound. This struggle defined the campaign, grinding down Japan's strength. After 6 months of horrific fighting, the Japanese finally conceded defeat. In February 1943, they evacuated their remaining starving and disease-ridden troops from Guadalcanal. The campaign had been incredibly costly for both sides, but it was a major strategic victory for the Allies. It marked the definitive end of Japan's offensive phase in the war. From this point forward, the Japanese would be on the defensive, fighting a desperate, bloody retreat all the way back to their home islands. The victory at Guadalcanal, combined with the earlier triumph at Midway, had fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the Pacific. The initiative had now passed firmly to the Allies. The Allied High Command in the Pacific, primarily led by U.S. General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific and Admiral Chester Nimitz in the Central Pacific, now developed a new strategy to defeat Japan. They realized that trying to capture every single Japanese-held island would be incredibly costly and time-consuming. Instead, they adopted a strategy of island hopping, or as MacArthur preferred to call it, leapfrogging. The plan was to bypass heavily fortified Japanese strongholds and instead seize more lightly defended but strategically important islands. These captured islands would then be turned into forward air bases and supply depots, allowing the Allies to hop closer and closer to Japan. This strategy had two major benefits. First, it allowed the Allies to maintain momentum, constantly pushing forward and keeping the Japanese off balance. Second, it left large Japanese garrisons on the bypassed islands to wither on the vine. Cut off from supplies and reinforcements by American air and sea power, these isolated soldiers could no longer contribute to the Japanese war effort. They were left to starve or succumb to disease, effectively neutralized without the need for a bloody frontal assault. This island-hopping campaign became the defining feature of the Pacific War from 1943 onwards, a slow, methodical, and brutal advance across the vast ocean. The path north was a grim and bloody one. Each island landing from Tarawa to Kwajalein, from Saipan to Peleliu, was a miniature D-Day, a horrific battle against a fanatical enemy who refused to surrender. American Marines and soldiers had to learn a new kind of warfare, fighting in dense jungles, volcanic caves, and fortified bunkers. The Japanese defenders, following the Bushido Code, fought to the last man, often launching suicidal banzai charges when defeat was inevitable. The casualty rates were appalling, but with each island taken, the Allies moved another step closer to the ultimate target, the home islands of Japan itself. The war of attrition had begun in earnest. While epic battles raged on distant fronts, the war was also fought far from any battlefield, in the towns and cities of the nations involved. This was a total war, a conflict that demanded the complete mobilization of entire societies. Every aspect of civilian life was reshaped to serve the war effort. Governments took unprecedented control over their economies and their people. Food, clothing, petrol, and almost every other commodity became subject to strict rationing systems. Citizens were issued ration books filled with coupons that dictated exactly how much they could buy. This was done to ensure that precious resources were conserved for the military and that everyone received a fair, if meager, share. The daily lives of ordinary people were transformed by these new realities. In Britain, families were encouraged to dig for victory, turning their gardens and public parks into vegetable patches to supplement their diet. In the United States, scrap metal drives became a common sight, with children collecting old pots, pans, and bicycle parts to be melted down for tanks and ships. In the Soviet Union, the sacrifices were even more extreme, with civilians enduring near-starvation conditions to keep the Red Army supplied. This shared experience of hardship and sacrifice fostered a strong sense of national unity and purpose, a feeling that everyone, not just the soldiers, was playing a part in the fight for survival. Propaganda was a powerful weapon on every home front, used to maintain morale, demonize the enemy, and encourage compliance with wartime measures. Posters, films, and radio broadcasts constantly reminded citizens of their duty. Iconic posters urged Americans to buy war bonds, warned Britons that careless talk costs lives, and depicted heroic Soviet workers exceeding their production quotas. The enemy was consistently portrayed in monstrous, inhuman terms, as brutal Japanese apes or sinister Nazi spiders, to fuel hatred and stiffen resolve. This relentless stream of information, both inspiring and terrifying, shaped the psychological landscape of the war for millions who never fired a shot. The threat of direct attack also brought the war home with terrifying immediacy. For years, British cities endured the Blitz, with families spending night after night in air raid shelters or the London Underground. Later in the war, Germany itself faced a far more devastating Allied bombing campaign that reduced cities like Hamburg and Dresden to seas of rubble, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. In Japan, the firebombing of Tokyo caused unimaginable destruction. This constant fear from the skies was a grim reminder that in modern warfare, there was no longer a clear line between the front line and the home front. Everyone was a target. The Second World War was decided not just by soldiers but by factories. President Roosevelt pledged the U.S. would become the arsenal of democracy. Automobile plants made bombers and tanks, shipyards mass-produced ships at a breathtaking pace. This production was powered by a revolution in the workforce. Women became welders and mechanics, proving they could do a man's work. In the Soviet Union, the factory front was brutal. Workers rebuilt factories and produced tanks that turned the tide on the Eastern Front. Germany relied on plundered resources and forced labor. The Allies' productive power overwhelmed the Axis. Across the vast territories occupied by the Axis powers, a secret, clandestine war was being fought. This was the War of the Resistance. In every conquered nation, from France and Poland to Norway and Yugoslavia, brave men and women refused to accept defeat. They formed underground networks to fight back against their occupiers in honestly 1,000 different ways. Their war was fought in the shadows, a dangerous contest of sabotage, espionage, and defiance. They were not a formal army but a scattered force of ordinary citizens, teachers, farmers, priests, and students, who risked everything for the hope of freedom. Their contribution to the Allied victory was immense and often unheralded. The methods of the resistance were varied and ingenious. Sabotage was a key activity. French maquisards blew up railway lines and bridges to disrupt the movement of German troops and supplies, especially in the lead-up to D-Day. Norwegian commandos undertook daring raids to destroy heavy water plants, sabotaging the German atomic bomb program. In addition to direct action, resistance groups ran extensive intelligence networks, gathering vital information on German troop movements and fortifications and smuggling it back to the Allies in London. They printed and distributed clandestine newspapers to counter Nazi propaganda and keep the flame of hope alive among the oppressed population. Life as a resistance fighter was a life of constant fear and peril. Discovery meant immediate arrest, followed by brutal interrogation and torture by the Gestapo or other security forces. Capture almost always ended in execution or deportation to a concentration camp. Resistance members lived with false papers, constantly moving from one safe house to another, trusting no one outside their small, tightly knit cells. Betrayal was an ever-present threat, as collaborators and informants were everywhere. Despite the immense danger, these networks not only survived but grew, creating a secret army that tied down hundreds of thousands of Axis troops who could have been fighting on the main fronts. In Eastern Europe and the Balkans, the resistance often took the form of large-scale partisan warfare. In Yugoslavia, the communist partisans led by Josip Broz Tito grew into a formidable army that liberated large areas of the country on its own. In the vast forests of Belarus and Ukraine, Soviet partisans waged a relentless guerrilla war against the German rear, attacking supply columns, assassinating officials, and creating chaos behind the lines. This partisan warfare was exceptionally brutal, with the Germans responding to attacks with savage reprisals, often burning entire villages and massacring their inhabitants. It was a no-quarter war, a desperate struggle for national survival fought with utter ruthlessness on both sides. In the shadow of the conventional war, the Nazi regime was carrying out another, even more horrific war. This was a war of extermination against the Jewish people of Europe, as well as millions of others they deemed undesirable: Slavs, Roma, political opponents, homosexuals, and the disabled. This systematic, state-sponsored genocide, known as the Holocaust or the Shoah, represents one of the darkest chapters in human history. It was not a byproduct of the war. For Hitler and the Nazi leadership, it was a central war aim, the culmination of years of virulent anti-Semitic ideology that viewed Jews as a racial enemy that had to be eliminated from the world. The process of persecution began long before the war, but the conflict provided the cover and the chaos for the Nazis to implement what they called the final solution to the Jewish question. Initially, this involved forcing Jews into overcrowded, sealed-off ghettos in Polish cities like Warsaw and Lodz, where they were left to die from starvation and disease. On the Eastern Front, special SS death squads called Einsatzgruppen followed behind the German army, rounding up and shooting over 1 million Jewish men, women, and children in mass executions. But for the Nazis, even this was not efficient enough for their genocidal ambitions. In 1942, at the Wannsee Conference in Berlin, top Nazi officials formalized the plan for the industrial-scale murder of Europe's Jews. They established a network of extermination camps, or death camps, located primarily in occupied Poland, places whose names would become synonymous with absolute evil: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. Jews from all over occupied Europe were rounded up, told they were being resettled and transported for days in horrifically crowded cattle cars. Upon arrival, most were sent directly to gas chambers disguised as showers. where they were murdered with poison gas. Their bodies were then burned in massive crematoria. It was a meticulously organized, bureaucratic system of mass murder. The scale of the Holocaust is almost impossible to comprehend. By the time the war ended, 6 million Jews, 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe, had been murdered. The Nazis created a parallel universe of camps, a continent-wide archipelago of terror and death. In these camps, a small number of prisoners were selected for slave labor, where they were worked to death under unimaginably brutal conditions. The Holocaust was not just a massacre, it was a deliberate attempt to erase an entire people, their culture, and their memory from the face of the earth. It stands as a terrifying testament to the depths of human depravity and the dangers of unchecked hatred and ideology. Even in the face of the Holocaust's horror, defiance flickered. Resistance took many forms, from armed uprisings to spiritual preservation. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising became a symbol of resistance against impossible odds. There were uprisings within death camps. Prisoners staged revolts, allowing inmates to escape. These acts were assertions of humanity in a place designed to strip it away. Beyond armed struggle, there was the daily resistance of trying to stay alive. The world also had its heroes, the righteous among the nations, who risked their lives to save Jews. Their bravery is a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hour, compassion could still be found. By 1944, the war had turned against Nazi Germany. The Soviets advanced on the Eastern Front. The Western Allies planned to open a second front in Western Europe with Operation Overlord. The invasion required meticulous planning. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was chosen to command the Allied Expeditionary Force. The Allies assembled a massive armada and air force. Millions of soldiers gathered in southern England. Operation Fortitude deceived the Germans, convincing them the invasion would be at Pas de Calais. Eisenhower chose June 6th after a storm delayed the initial launch. He gave the order, "Okay, let's go." The fate of Europe was at stake. In the dark, pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, the invasion began. The first to go into action were the airborne troops. Their mission was to seize key bridges and coastal batteries. As dawn broke, the vast Allied naval armada appeared off the coast of Normandy. The fleet unleashed a thunderous naval bombardment. Then came the landing craft, carrying the first wave of infantry towards 5 code-named beaches. The British and Canadians landed on Sword, Juno, and Gold beaches. The Americans were assigned to Utah and Omaha beaches. But at Omaha Beach, the plan went horribly wrong. The American soldiers were met with a murderous wall of machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire. The beach became a horrific killing field. With incredible bravery, they started to move forward, slowly making their way up the heavily fortified bluffs. The Allies were ashore, but the battle for France had only just begun. Securing the D-Day beachheads was just the first step. The Allies had to break out into the French countryside, but Normandy's landscape proved difficult. It was a dense patchwork of fields and thick hedgerows known as the Bocage. Each hedgerow had to be taken in bloody close quarters fighting against a determined German defense. It was a brutal attritional battle, a nightmare for the attacking Allied soldiers. Progress was slow and came at a horrific price. Allied fighter bombers hampered the Germans' ability to resupply. The breakthrough finally came at the end of July with Operation Cobra. The plan involved using heavy bombers to carpet bomb the German front. The German front in Normandy finally collapsed. The brutal Battle of the Bocage was over. The success of Operation Cobra completely changed the complexion of the war in France. The stalemate was broken, and a war of movement had begun. As General Patton's Third Army raced south and then east, the remaining German forces in Normandy were threatened with encirclement. In what became known as the Falaise Pocket, Allied forces closed in from the north and south, trapping the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. The pocket became a scene of utter carnage. Allied aircraft and artillery relentlessly pounded the trapped Germans as they tried to escape through a narrow gap. The roads were choked with thousands of destroyed vehicles and the bodies of men and horses, a scene one pilot described as a slaughterhouse. With the German army in Normandy effectively destroyed, the road to Paris was open. Initially, the Allied High Command planned to bypass the capital to avoid a costly urban battle and the responsibility of feeding its millions of inhabitants. However, for the French people and their leader in exile, General Charles de Gaulle, the liberation of their capital was of immense symbolic importance. As Allied forces drew near, the French resistance within Paris rose up in open revolt against the German garrison. To prevent a massacre and to support the uprising, Eisenhower changed his mind and ordered French and American forces to advance on the city. On August 25, 1944, after 4 years of Nazi occupation, Paris was liberated. The scenes were of pure, unbridled joy. Crowds of ecstatic Parisians thronged the streets, showering the Allied soldiers with flowers, kisses, and wine. General de Gaulle made a triumphant return, leading a victory parade down the Champs-Élysées and re-establishing a free French government. The liberation of Paris was a powerful moment, a symbol to the world that the end of Nazi tyranny was in sight. However, the celebrations were marred by the ugly settling of scores, as women accused of horizontal collaboration with the Germans had their heads shaved in public acts of humiliation. Following the liberation of Paris, the Allied armies surged across France and Belgium at incredible speed. The German retreat turned into a rout. It seemed as though the war might be over by Christmas. Allied supply lines, however, became stretched to the breaking point as they struggled to keep up with the rapid advance. This logistical problem, known as the Red Ball Express, eventually forced the Allies to slow down as they approached the German border and the formidable defenses of the Siegfried Line. The exhilarating race across France was over, and the Allies now faced the grim prospect of a hard, bloody fight into the heart of the Reich itself. As autumn of 1944 turned to winter, the Allied advance stalled. They had outrun their supplies and now faced stiffening German resistance along the border of the Reich. A sense of complacency began to set in among some Allied commanders, who believed that the German army was a spent force, incapable of launching any major counteroffensive. But they were wrong. Adolf Hitler, in a last desperate gamble, was secretly massing his last reserves for a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, the same region where his armies had broken through in 1940. His aim was to split the British and American armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp, hoping to force the Western Allies into a negotiated peace. On December 16, 1944, under the cover of thick winter fog that grounded the Allied air forces, the German offensive began. 3 German armies crashed into a weakly held sector of the American front line. The initial assault caught the Americans completely by surprise. American divisions were overrun, and thousands were taken prisoner. The German advance created a large bulge in the American lines, giving the battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge. The fighting was confused and desperate, taking place in freezing forests and snow-covered villages. It was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II. A crucial moment came at the vital road junction of Bastogne. The U.S. 101st Airborne Division found itself completely surrounded by German forces. When the German commander demanded their surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe gave a now legendary one-word reply: nuts. The stubborn defense of Bastogne by the Screaming Eagles became a symbol of American resolve. They held the town against repeated attacks, denying the Germans a critical road network. Their heroic stand bought precious time for the Allies to recover and rush reinforcements. Ultimately, Hitler's Ardennes offensive was doomed to fail. It was based on sheer fantasy, underestimating Allied strength and overestimating German capabilities. The Germans did not have enough fuel to reach their objectives, and once the weather cleared after Christmas, the Allied air forces returned to the skies, wreaking havoc on the exposed German columns. Allied reinforcements, including Patton's Third Army, executed a brilliant turn to relieve Bastogne, squeezing the Bulge from both sides. By the end of January 1945, the Germans had been pushed back to their starting lines, having suffered irreplaceable losses. The gamble had failed, and Germany's last offensive strength was spent. The road into Germany was now wide open. By 1945, Nazi Germany's fate was sealed. The Wehrmacht's offensive power was shattered. The Reich faced its final twilight. The Soviet Red Army launched its final offensive into Germany. Allied armies advanced, uncovering the horrors of the Holocaust. The world confronted the evil it had been fighting. The final battle was fought in Berlin. Hitler descended into madness in his bunker. On April 30th, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. The Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag. Germany surrendered in May. The war in Europe was over. As celebrations erupted in Europe, the Pacific War raged on. Allied forces reached Japan's doorstep, facing suicidal resistance at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Kamikaze attacks and predictions of millions of Allied casualties loomed. B-29 bombers relentlessly targeted Japanese cities, causing immense destruction. The firebombing of Tokyo killed an estimated 100,000 people. Japan refused to surrender, prompting the Allies to consider a terrifying new option. The Manhattan Project's atomic bomb was tested in July 1945. President Truman decided to use it, hoping for a swift end to the war. On August 6, the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, vaporizing the city. After a second bomb on Nagasaki and Soviet declaration of war, Emperor Hirohito intervened. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, ending World War II. The war brought relief, but also revealed a world scarred. The old world order was gone, and two superpowers emerged: the United States and the Soviet Union. Their alliance crumbled, replaced by the Cold War. The Nuremberg trials established individual accountability for war crimes. The United Nations was created to prevent future conflicts. The war reminds us of the human cost of conflict and the fragility of peace. It reshaped our world and serves as a warning against tyranny.